Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Bené Hirschon. I'm the Community Engagement Director at the Cheshire County Conservation District. We're so excited to see so many new and familiar faces today. So welcome to Radically Rural. We're so excited that you all could join us both in person and online. We have a few folks tuning in. The way this panel is going to work is we have some great youth activists today who are going to be speaking about their work, but we'll be saving some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you're online, you can feel free to type any questions you have in the chat. Perfect. So just some general housekeeping. Just so you all know, the bathrooms and water are just located outside of the door. And tonight at 5:30, there's going to be the Connect event. It's going to be a dinner and fiber shed fashion show, which is going to be a whole lot of fun. So we hope you guys can be there. And then tomorrow at 2 p.m., the Landing Community Track will be hosting a session on inclusivity in the outdoors. And the Clean Energy Track is also going to be hosting a session on natural climate solutions. And I'm going to hand this over to Rob Werner, who has also organized this session and is working on the Clean Energy Track.
Thanks so much, Bené. Yes, so I'm Rob Werner. I'm the New Hampshire State Director for the League of Conservation Voters, and we're so pleased to be able to be here today and tomorrow as well for this week. It's just really incredible, and I think that the outpouring of support and interest in Radically Rural has only grown. This is the largest attendance that we've had for this conference, for this summit, and I think it will only grow from here. So it's really exciting to see that. So yes, we are very pleased to work with Bené in terms of bringing this discussion on youth climate perspectives together. I want to turn it over to my colleague and my good friend, Anthea Lavallee, who's the Executive Director of the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation. We're so pleased at the League of Conservation Voters to work with Hubbard Brook and some other organizations to found the Emerging Climate Leaders Collaborative, which really lifts up youth voices in this space. It's so important. And it's so important to provide opportunities for our young people to take leadership roles and develop leadership roles and develop the confidence to be able to have their agency in this arena. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Anthea.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was a introduction. And I'm just wondering, logistically, is it possible to turn the lights down just a tad? Hopefully. I don't know if you can tell, but we've got them beaming right in our eyes, and it makes us hard to see you. And given that this is a smallish crowd, I hope that we can have lots of good interaction at the end. And so, as Rob said, I'm Anthea Lavallee. I'm the Executive Director of the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation. And I have a little habit when I give talks of asking people to raise their hands if they've ever heard of Hubbard Brook. Oh, wow. Cool. Cool. Anybody want to share what they know? It helps to give me a read on the audience. Anyone know a fact about Hubbard Brook? Yep. Black-throated blue warblers. Excellent. And did she have a good time? That's awesome. That's awesome. So I won't go too deep into Hubbard Brook, but just in a nutshell, it's an 8,000-acre experimental forest. It's about 2 hours north of here in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And there are 3 essential units at Hubbard Brook, although we work very collaboratively together. There's the physical operation that's run by the USDA Forest Service that was established in 1955. And then there is this vast interdisciplinary, intergenerational research collaborative of scientists from about 30 institutions all across the country, but with critical mass here in New England, basically everything that's going on in that ecosystem. And so I have a cheeky expression where I say roots to shoots, microbes to molecules. They love that ecosystem down to the molecule. And what I do at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, I think is the best part because it's the most interesting and exciting in my opinion. I and my team spend all of our time thinking about how we can connect Hubbard Brook science to people on the front lines of environmental decision making. And that basically means everyone. So you here today, teachers, students, land and resource managers, policymakers, you name it. Our goal is really to connect the Hubbard Brook science and the scientists to people who can use it in order to make informed decisions about policy and practice. And I think of it as an infinity loop. So we are sharing scientific information, and we're also bringing real world issues back to the scientists so that we can become better integrated in that ongoing kind of on and on sort of way. And as Rob mentioned, it was actually in one of my favorite initiatives, our youth engagement, that Rob and I got to know each other and become colleagues. And it happened in kind of a big bang, audacious fashion. It was about 3 years ago that we had this wild idea that we were going to host a youth event just a couple of days before the New Hampshire primary for the presidential candidates. And that's how Rob and I got to know each other. So we had this crazy idea. We teamed up. We pulled in some collaborators from the Union of Concerned Scientists and also partners at the Revers Energy Institute at Dartmouth to put on this all-day event. It was just a couple of days before the primary and a few more days before the pandemic took everything sideways. It was an actual big in-person event in Concord in February 2020. And what we did was we gathered together a group of about 20 New Hampshire-based students, so environmental students. They were high school students, undergraduate students, and graduate students. And we worked with them over the course of several weeks. We brought in science to policy trainers, we did mock panels, and then each set of 3 students engaged with one of the presidential candidates in succession over the course of an entire day. We had 6 presidential candidates in attendance on that day. We had 2 surrogates. I think the only piece of bad luck that we had was that it happened to be on the day of Trump's impeachment proceedings. And so Bernie Sanders couldn't come. He sent an amazing surrogate, Varshini Prakash. And Elizabeth Warren also couldn't come, but she sent Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson in her place. So it was an incredible group of candidates and surrogates. But I have to say, from where I was sitting, and it attracted incredible national media coverage. So every major national news outlet was there. It was the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, Time Magazine, Fox News, you name it, they were there. More than 40 media outlets that had their cameras focused squarely on the candidates. But where we were sitting in the front row, I think we had a front row seat for the power of the youth environmental movement. And to me, the students were the stars of the show. I get chills when I think of it in my mind's eye, how incredibly, impeccably prepared those young people were, how brave they were in sharing their personal stories and what they feel they stand to lose to existential environmental crises like climate change. And over the arc of a 2-minute question, they wove in their personal stories, their scientific expertise, and then zeroed in on one of the candidates' policies or positions. It was an amazing day. We had 500 plus people in attendance. We had about 1,000 live streaming, and we thought, we can't stop here. And that's how the Emerging Climate Leaders Collaborative really got kicked off. And Rob and I and members of our team have been working together on high-profile youth engagement events ever since. And then I'll also take the opportunity to put in a little bit of a plug for a program that I and my team launched at Hubbard Brook about 2 years ago called Young Voices of Science. This was also inspired by that day. And so what we do, we recruited some private funders to fund the semester-long communications training program for environmental students. And so what they do is they Zoom in from all across the country 1 night a week for about 7 weeks and train with some of the world's experts in science to policy, outreach, and communication. Things like how to write an op-ed, how to tell the story in podcast and rhetorical techniques. There's just so much that can be learned. It's free. And the reason I'm plugging this is that we put out a call for students to submit applications to participate, and the deadline is on Friday. So if you maybe want to participate, throw your hat in, I encourage you to look for that website. It's youngvoicesofscience.org, and tell the young people in your life who might be interested. So obviously, I'm delighted to be here today. I've never been part of Radically Rural, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this particular panel. I love talking about nature, and I love working with inspiring young people. And so with that, I think we all decided that the panelists are going to introduce themselves. So I will turn the mic over to Nikhil.
Hi, I'm Nikhil Chavda. I am a high school senior at Co-Brown, and I am the Youth Action Fellow at 350 New Hampshire. Is that it? Okay.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? All right. Okay. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a Keene State College student studying sustainability and inequality studies. I am also a community organizer in the Keene and Greater Keene area. And my focus is on creating intersectionality in community building and holding those accountable for the climate crisis, like big corporations and the system that we work in, accountable for the violence caused on the climate crisis. And yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Phoebe Dolan and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm from Maine. Is anyone from Maine? Hey, people from Maine. That's awesome. I live in Swanville, Maine, which is a town of 1,000 people outside of Belfast in the Mid-Coast area. And I'm the co-director of Maine Youth Power, which is a youth-led rural youth movement throughout Maine. And I'm probably going to talk a lot more about it, so I won't say more now.
Okay, and so what we decided in terms of format, we have a pretty cool question bank that we came up with ourselves. We're going to work through some of those questions, and I'll ask a question and they'll respond, and we can do some crosstalk as well. And then at the end, at about 4:30, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if that sounds good, we'll go ahead and dig in. Okay, so the first question, I guess we can kind of go through in this order. Oh, and we also agreed that if they don't happen to like a particular question, they can choose not to answer it or answer something else or share something that they feel is maybe a little bit more interesting from their point of view. So the first question that I'm going to ask is, what was happening in your life when you really knew that environmental activism was something that you wanted to tackle in this kind of way? And we can go in any order, actually. So if someone wants to grab it first, just let me know.
For me, it's not a singular event that happened that made me want to work with climate activism or just activism in general, though I feel weird about the word activism, but that's another thing. But for me, it's this progression of getting older, learning more about the world, and seeing how things work around me and seeing how things are not just and they're not working the way that they should. And it was just really frustrating, and I felt really helpless when I was younger, before of voting age is what a lot of people say, like, go out and vote. And so instead of waiting until I was of voting age, attending rallies, I started having discussions with people around me and just, trying to gain more information and understand, like, what can I do as a person, and what can I do with my community to combat this climate crisis and to combat inequality around the world and in our country.
I think that when that happened for me, I was a freshman in high school, and I was still learning more about myself, looking around the world and thinking, hey, what's going on out here? And I really like to read the news. So I remember reading the news one day, and I think it was a little bit after the midterms, so maybe around December. And I was reading about winter storms, I think it was, that were just increasing in frequency and severity. And at the same time, there were like insane fires and maybe cyclones happening in the southern hemisphere. And that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole where I was thinking, hey, so how is all of this like increasing in frequency and severity. And I noticed, oh, it all has a common thread: climate change. The Earth is changing, mostly through human activity, kind of messing all of nature up. And so I was just kind of thinking, well, what can I do about this? And I was talking to one of my friends who I think now works for a New Hampshire youth movement, but they were telling me about how they were part of a climate organization called 350 New Hampshire. And I could come to a meeting, see what they were all about, and see if I was interested in maybe joining them. And I joined them, and in that one meeting, it was a Zoom meeting, and I saw that all of them were really passionate, really friendly, and all of them were really focused on helping the environment and their future and seeing how they could make a difference. And I was really drawn to that. So I've been a part of that organization for 4 years now, and I've loved every second of it, trying to make the environment and our future better.
I would say I was one of those young children who staunchly believed when something was wrong that it should be called out. And I think when I was in 3rd grade, I started petitions in my school to stop forcing us to go outside at recess in the winter because I didn't like being cold. And I didn't actually remember that. Some teachers told me that when I started doing more activism in high school. They're like, oh, you've always been doing this. So I don't know if I have a start date I remember, but I think really, like, as soon as you realize that you're inheriting, that young people are inheriting all the like crap that exists in our communities, in messed up systems that don't serve us, young people will get really scared. And I think because there's so much isolation these days, not only just because of COVID, but just because young people are isolated through technology, through lack of community, through all the things that we see happening, this like epidemic, as I see it, or pandemic of isolation, I found the thesis that I came up with is that it's fought by community. And therefore, I found organizing. If you are going to fight grief with community, you better build some really solid community. And community leads to resiliency, which leads to a future where when things go downhill, we're all still here for each other. And I really firmly believed that. And I think I was probably like 16 or 17 and then just started organizing different things. But I still think that's very true. And I think all young people, I think Nat said that activist is kind of a problematic word for them. And I think every single person is an activist and should be one. It just depends how active they are. And I think young people, most young people, can be pulled into making the world a better place because it's their future too.
Holy cow, these are great answers. Do you mind if I go rogue a little bit and ask some follow-up questions that I'm kind of intrigued about? And so, Nat, you were saying that you find the word activism problematic. I'm really curious. Do you feel comfortable digging into that and unpacking?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I hear the word activist and it's like very much like self-serving, and it's like I'm doing this action to get recognition, and I don't like that. I think that we should be doing things because it feels good, and that, you know, we're doing things because it's for the betterment of ourselves, for our community, for the people we care about, for the people we don't care about, but for our community. And so to me, I like to say community builder, or just, you know, like, I don't know, it just, to me, it's self-serving and it can be performative. And I want it to be more humanizing and more like the work I'm doing is just because I'm frustrated with the world around me. I need to get that frustration out somehow, and I do it by working with others, building community, calling out the things that are wrong in our society. And I'm not trying to do that to make myself feel better.
And then I had a follow-up question for Nikhil. You were talking about being an avid news reader, and I'm always curious when I'm talking to young people where they get their news and how they get their news, and if you have thoughts about echo chambers, and do you deliberately try to seek alternate viewpoints? How do you curate your news sources and feeds?
Okay, so I started off loving the news after, well, I mean, I didn't love it at first because I was like 8 and my parents were having me read it every day, and I wasn't super into that, but over time I like got deeper, and we as a family have a New York Times subscription, so I just started finding random stories on there that interested me. And as I kept reading, I was like, wow, this is actually really cool. And all of the different viewpoints on like news websites and all of the different beliefs and the editorials and the opinion sections. And I started to branch out. So I wanted a balanced viewpoint. So I read some Washington Post. I tried the, oh gosh, I don't remember what it's called. It was more so I read that for a while, and I started to notice that a lot of the things I was seeing on social media were a lot more dramatized and a lot more negative, and I started to feel like that was an echo chamber. So I stopped getting any of my news from social media and focused on just like real newspapers and news dissemination sources built for that. So I feel like I got a much more positive and diverse um, mindset from all of those different online newspapers.
Great. And I had a follow-up question for Phoebe too. So I totally relate. I loved what you said about the playground and how you were advocating at that age. And I relate to that whistleblower tendency, or I think maybe the modern word is like disruptor. I'm not sure if I got that right. And I have that inclination myself. And I know how that mentality can both lift you up, but it can also weigh you down when it feels like it's, it takes a lot of energy to be that person who's calling things out. Do you have techniques or practices that you use in order to keep yourself in that up mode, or how do you handle the weight of it when you're that person?
Question. I think I describe myself and have been described as the most extroverted person someone's ever met, like on multiple occasions. And I think I genuinely feed so deeply off of other people's energy in such a positive way. I rarely tire, which is, I find every day to be a more unique trait. I do a lot of yoga, which I think is a huge part of why I'm still organizing. I'm 24, so I'm not that old, but I'm definitely older. I organize with people who are 16 and 17 sometimes, and there is definitely an arc of the raw sort of sadness, stress, and anger that someone who's 16 has, and you like helping temper that, how fast they rise in organizing, because burnout is like this thing that doesn't have to happen. And the more you learn about how it doesn't have to happen, the more you're proactive in building a movement that's irresistible. The idea that like activism, I believe deeply that the movement should reflect what you want to see in the world. You shouldn't be stressing out trying to build a better world because you'll never get it. And the irresistible movement model leads me and my organization towards rest, towards reflection, towards evaluation, as well towards direct action and political action. So we're balancing differently. And I think I try my best as a director to also do that in myself, which I'm really bad at, but I work really hard at. And I realize that everything I do is modeling for someone else. So it's when you realize those things, you continue to craft the irresistible movement for all, including yourself in that.
I love that. And I love irresistible. And so what a great word. I'm taking notes, so I'm going to be unpacking my brain for a long time. Okay. And so as a young climate, I'm going to back off of the word leader because I know that that has implications. But in your climate work as a young person, is there a particular impact that you feel most proud of?
I remember, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, Governor Sununu was a really strong advocate for the Granite Bridge pipeline, which was a pipeline project that would basically pump natural gas into New Hampshire, and it was supposed to like lower energy prices, but what it would have actually done was make New Hampshire more reliant on fossil fuels. And I remember 350 New Hampshire and, you know, most of the environmentally focused community being very opposed to it. So when I was with 350 New Hampshire, we all decided to get pretty active about that issue specifically, and we focused on it for an entire year. So one of my favorite memories with them is that we painted a fire extinguisher and delivered it to the New Hampshire Senate Majority Leader Dan Feltes, and said, "You're going to need this to put out the fire that these fossil fuels are eventually going to cause on the planet." And I felt like that was probably one of my favorite actions I did with them. So we did other things to try and get that project shut down, like sticker campaigns and email campaigns to our legislators and some of the officials in charge of that project. But yeah, I think that was one of our high points.
I'll be honest, this is a question that I looked at and had a bit of a hard time thinking and trying to come up with an answer for, because I see the work that my community does and that I do with my community as not like individual accomplishments. These are community impacts, and it's hard for me to be like, oh, this is something I did, which, you know, there is an importance in being like, oh, I'm really proud of myself and what I've done. But to me, I feel like I'm more proud of what the grassroots communities that I've been a part of have been able to accomplish since I've been really active, which honestly, I'm almost 22. It's been about, you know, 5-ish years since that I've been really going at this. I can't really name one specific thing. It's more of just, I'm constantly proud and proud of my community and proud of how they uplift me and how I am proud of the work that I do within my community.
I'm going to have a two-part answer. The first thing I would say is my current organization is almost 2 years old and no one's ever left. We've only ever grown. So the 7 people who launched it are all still part of it. And that is the most proud I've ever been of anything in my life. The climate action cool thing would be I went to college with Benet at Brandeis. Shout out Benet. And I was part of their climate justice organization called Brandeis Climate Justice. And we were trying to get the university to divest. The university has still not divested, just so everyone knows. It's been an almost 9-year campaign. And we would do different actions to continue that along. I went there when it was like 5 years in. And one action we staged, which I helped organize, was the board of trustees meets in this glass room. It has like a 3-sided glass floor to ceiling windows on this deck. And we staged a 77-person like storm of the deck with posters holding up like giant banners that say, oh, like, please come out. We were trying to get them to set a date to vote on divestment because, as everyone knows, bureaucracy likes to keep pushing your date of like when they'll make a decision until you graduate. And so we were done having them do that. So we did something called a mic check, where it's like one person says a phrase and then we all repeated it to sort of like launch the sound into the building. And my favorite part of this action was that we had about 25 of those people show up with instruments. So we had like 5 people playing the saxophone and someone with a full drum kit who had set up below the deck. And we had people with trumpets and like people playing guitars and ringing tambourines and bells. And like it went from, we were silent and we like crept up and then we just like launched around the building really fast. And we did get the president of the university and the president of the board of trustees to come out, and they set a date. They gave us a 20-day date, which was awesome. And of course, they voted not to divest, but it was a very cool action. And I think it was creative in a way that I'm excited about. Yeah.
I love that, Phoebe. And there's something so playful about it. It's disruptive, but there's something playful about it as well that I think is genius. And it makes me wonder, because existential environmental crisis is like a pretty heavy concept. Do you think there's a place for humor, and how do you see that fitting in to environmental work when it comes to raising awareness? Because it can be a pretty serious, heavy topic. Any thoughts? Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, I can start. I think in any movement, there needs to be joy. Fuel a movement just by sadness, just by despair. You need joy. You need radical optimism. You need something that'll fuel it, that'll give you the imagination to imagine a world outside of the one that you live in. And without the playfulness, without that joy, without the fun, you're just gonna be like weighed down and bogged down. There needs to be that joy.
Yeah, the climate crisis is at times a pretty depressing topic, and I just think that it's really important to, stay happy, stay having fun. You don't want to burn out, so it's just really important to make space to prioritize yourself and your community, but also to just cut loose sometimes and make sure that you guys are still having fun together, because you're a team. You want to be having fun with your friends even while you're working on an issue this important.
I would say people say there's like different types of power, right? So there's like people power, and there's money power, and there's position power. You can't, in my opinion, people power has a lot of benefits, and one is it's got all the people, and organized people are more powerful than money. It's been proven, obviously, like unions, things like that. If we go with that as our idea, then you can't fight money or political people in political power with their own game, because they'll win. You have to do something, like you got to go to the side. I live on a farm where there's sheep, and if a sheep's charging you, you like put your hand sideways. It doesn't understand this plane. It only understands this plane. So like if a ram's charging you, go like that. It's like, whoa, and runs away. I feel very similarly, like single tactic a corporation's tactics is not prepared for like 3,000 people in clown costumes, like sitting in front of their building. Like they're not prepared for that. I was recently at a action with Migrant Justice, which does the Milk with Dignity campaign for farm workers. So it's calling Hannafords to pay more for their milk. And we did a huge action with a ton of farm workers at the Scarborough, Maine Hannaford headquarters. And they weren't prepared for us. We wrapped their building with postcards all tied together that were people of Vermont and Maine asking them to sign Milk with Dignity. And they didn't know what to do. They had security watching us do it. And they were like, I guess, but at the same time, we had tons of news there that was filming it. So it was fascinating.
These are so great. And so I just wanted to remark that I'm noticing a trend that the word community has come up more than 5 times. And then other similar words, team, people power. This seems to be a common thread through every single answer. And I just love that. And just a personal observation, I moved to New England when I was in my 30s, so a fully fledged adult. But it wasn't until I lived here that I really learned. I was essentially raised in terms of community values in my home state of Vermont and what it really means to live enfolded in community. And I read an article recently that some social scientists think it connects back to small, rural, snowbound communities just developed an ethic of taking care of one another. And I sometimes wonder if it's that legacy that we're carrying forward, this concept of we're in it together, we're taking care of one another. And I think it's really special. And so I think there are opportunities in the work that you're doing, you're talking about, that can lead the nation.
I just wanted to add a comment because I heard the snowbound rural communities aspect, and honestly, for me, when I think of communities, I more think of indigenous communities and communities that are marginalized. They have to come together, and I look to those kinds of communities to really understand like their their tactics and like what they do. I actually never thought about like rural snowbound communities, because to me, I'm not actually originally from New England. I'm from Virginia, and moving up to New Hampshire, it's very isolating here. There is a lack of community up here, compared to down in the South, where like we would have cul-de-sacs and we would have Tuesday soup nights. I don't do that up here, and it's just the lack of community up here really frustrated me. So it was interesting to hear that comment, because I think of more of like the southern, in America at least, the southern communities, mainly of poor folks who like come together and help feed each other.
I honestly, I have been in New Hampshire my entire life in the same little town, and I've actually found a pretty strong sense of community there. Like, I think that you were right personally about the snowbound towns and how, winter sets in and everyone's out having fun and going to each other's house and making hot chocolate. And like, even when power goes out, people do things like lend out their generators so other people can like charge their phones. And I just think that this, like, my little town has such a strong sense of community, and we're always there for each other. And we do things like go over, and we have an elderly neighbor, and a lot of people have gone over with meals and just to visit. And I think that it really is a community, and we've always just been like there for each other. And obviously that is a really similar experience to what you just talked about with everyone pulling together and helping each other in tough circumstances. But I do think there is also something to be said for these little towns in New Hampshire.
I just really appreciate everyone sharing their personal experiences, and that we have an awareness that not everyone's having the same experience in snow or no snow or north or south. There's a variety of ways that we can experience community or feel isolated. And I really appreciate the personal sharing. So, okay. Now, this is a good one for me. I know I don't look it, but I'm half Greek, and I actually have no problem with conflict. And Rob knows this. I have a terrible habit of interrupting all the time. And we joke in my family that we have 5 conflicts before breakfast, which is right. I mean, there's a different styles of engaging with conflict in New England, I have found. And so my question really is, how do you navigate conflict and difficult conversations relative to your environmental work? Do you have tips or techniques or an approach that works for you, or do you switch it up depending on the context?
So my background, or at least my focus, is actually in restorative justice. And that is all about like nonviolent communication and like how to work through conflict in a way that like doesn't harm others in the process. And so a lot of what that entails is like listening, which I know we all know how to listen, but there's a certain kind of listening that a lot of us have forgotten how to do, and it's just like to sit there and like soak up the information, not think of a response while someone else is talking. And so like slowing down and really like listening to what a person is saying, even if you disagree with it, trying to understand like this is what they're saying, this is their experience, and then trying to acknowledge that and just be like, I hear your experience, and then share yours, and hope that they're also listening, and just kind of trying to foster that that conversation.
I'm trying to think, like, handling conflict is such a big statement. I think so. To speak from a truly youth perspective, where I organize in Maine, people are just not expecting us, like not expecting young people to be organizing, not expecting us to know what we're doing, not expecting us to have an analysis of anything. Truly, it's remarkable. And I was aware of that before starting Maine Youth Power, but less so than I should have been. And I think there's just an extreme level of adults and adult-led organizations just being like, yeah, no, like your idea is cool, but like, no. And you'd imagine with how well the Sunrise Movement has done in the world that people in activist spaces would stop talking about how like you don't know what you're doing and actually be like, look at all this incredible change. Like, look at the Inflation Reduction Act. Like that was basically mostly brought to you by the Sunrise Movement and people and anyone who advocated for the Green New Deal. And so there's just like that to me, and that to me brings up an extreme amount of anger because I don't understand why adults think that. I genuinely don't. I can't imagine why you think young people don't know what they're talking about when they're talking about what it means to be young. Like, it just seems weird. So that's something I feel like I deal with a lot, and I spend time helping prepping young people to like go into those spaces. Like, we're gonna go talk to some people and they really might talk down to you, and like, here's some things you might say when they do that, so you're not just frozen, or here's some things you might think about. We do a lot of lobbying in the Maine Congress, and some politicians do that a lot. But in terms of, I see a lot of conflict. The other sort of ways I navigate conflict is through coaching young people and dealing with interpersonal things with their parents. And because we're in a rural place, a lot of people have extremely different political perspectives than their families. And it's a growing edge for me. I'm still learning how to do that well, but we do a lot of talking about how to talk to our families about what we believe and what we think and what issues matter to us when it comes to climate, especially, and when it comes to all the things. So it's sort of two areas.
I think that sometimes conflict is a good thing. It's a sign of change. Like maybe 10 years ago, people just did not take the climate movement seriously at all. Climate activists were outright dismissed and ignored and made fun of for believing in crazy things. And now it's like they're being they've become such a part of the yeah, there's conflict, but there's also such a recognition of them as an entity and climate change as a real issue that real people are focusing on. And I personally have not really had a ton of conflict, but what I have has been really a lot of dismissal, but I still consider that dismissal as overall a net positive because, like, if I'm in the Senate Majority Leader's office with my team and we get dismissed, like, we were still there in the first place. That's a step forward. And yeah.
I wanted to touch on like the first thing you said that really stuck with me is like conflict is a good thing, and I agree. There is a very common place in political spaces where we don't want to ruffle feathers. It reminds me of a white supremacy culture characteristic called the right to comfort, where we prioritize our own comfort more than hearing something that goes against our beliefs. And I see that a lot in political spaces, not just in climate activism spaces, but just in local politics, in larger politics. It's just like the minute you say something that someone disagrees with, they shut down because they have a right to comfort. And no, I think having conflict, having disagreements is important, and it pivots things to growth. And being open to disagreement, being open to conflict is incredibly important, because if not, we're not going to grow, and we're just going to close down, and we're not going to listen. And I see that so often in political spaces, and it's very frustrating. And again, it points back to the right of comfort, which is a characteristic of white supremacy culture.
These are such great answers. And it reminds me of an aphorism that I often take with me and will sometimes recite in particularly contentious meetings. And it's that the lack of conflict isn't necessarily harmony. Oftentimes it's apathy. And so needing to get in there and really do that tough work when you're facing a variety of opinions is so critical. Okay, so let's see. This I'm going to go straight from the script because I thought it was such a well-prepared question. So how are the people of our society who are most vulnerable to climate change supported by or excluded from rural communities?
I feel like overall they are excluded. I mean, when you think of a rural community, you think of a mainly farmland, mainly white community. And what land are we on? We're on indigenous land. We are like at the forefront of that. Like, where are the indigenous people to begin with? Like, they're not at the they are at the forefront. They're fighting to be at the forefront, but there's such systematic oppression that they're not being listened to. And so indigenous people are not being listened to, and they're not in rural communities, and definitely in other communities they're being suppressed. And then people of other marginalized identities, and even poor people do make up a large portion of rural communities, but there are a lot of systems in place that can you restate the question actually?
Yeah, it was kind of a long one. So how are the people of our society who are most vulnerable to climate change supported by or excluded from rural communities?
Yeah, so so to finish my thought, the communities that are going to be most affected are poor, marginalized people of color. And those are the ones that are overworked, that are working 3, 4, many jobs. And so it's hard to tie in the rural aspect to this, I will be fully honest, mainly because rural areas are mainly white. And so, it's the cities that are seeing the most impact to climate change. And so, in a way, rural areas can kind of like, turn a blind eye to what is happening to the communities that are most impacted by climate change. I'm hoping that makes sense. It's a complicated question, but to get down to the main of it, they're not being supported, and we need to do better.
Can I hear the question one more time? I'm so sorry.
That's why I'm reading it like verbatim. Okay, how are the people of our society who are most vulnerable to climate change, so the people who are really on the front lines, supported or excluded from rural communities?
Like, as in, like, excluded from living there or excluded from, like, reaping the benefits? Okay, cool. I super agree with what Nat said. To add to what Nat said, I would love to jump into a middle of one thing you said around rural communities having fewer frontline issues with climate change and having fewer people of color. I think in Maine, so Maine is like, if not the whitest state, it is second to Vermont. And there are a lot of people of color in Maine. And they are wildly underserved because people just say Maine is white and then don't bother finding people of color to lead things. And I think rural communities are, especially in Maine, are highly, highly affected from climate change because Maine fishes a lot in the Gulf of Maine. And laws, if anyone's been following, Maine people been following the right whale and the lobsterman trap line debacle, people are like extremely out of work right now. And so there's been a lot, which is the right whale's there because of climate change. And so there's a lot going on that sort of affects in multifaceted ways industry, as well as Maine has multiple indigenous reservations on the coast, which are like also folks that are fishing and farming the land. And so I think but why I agree with Nat is because yes, like frontline communities are not in leadership positions because they're unable to do so because we live in a society that favors white attributes and favors white supremacy culture, and favors educated people and favors men and people with money and all the things. But I do think rural communities have a beauty of common cause around necessities. And I think something that I've noticed as I live in a rural community is really no matter who your neighbor votes for, like they will come jumpstart your car, they will offer you a tractor part, they will share maple syrup that they just boiled down, and that has all those things have happened to me with cars covered in Trump stickers. And they don't care that I'm wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt when I like get out of my car and ask for assistance. And I think like, yes, I'm a white person, but I think rural communities, people have each other's backs in a different way. I don't think people have as much agency and change because of the element of government leadership being not representative of where people are from. But I do think, yeah, in a long round way, I do think rural communities have the backs of frontline folks.
I honestly don't think I have anything to add to that. They both covered the question so well.
That was fantastic. So what I thought I'd do is ask one more question from here, but then give the last question or questions to you before we open it up to the audience. If there are questions on this sheet or questions that occur to you that we haven't covered yet before we go to the audience. So one more from our list. What do you need in terms of support for your work? How can we or members of your community give you the tools that you need to get to the next level or to do your work the way that you want to do it? How can you be supported?
Got two things off the bat. One is don't be an adult that says the thing. I'm so glad you're doing that. Someone needs to save the world. Like, never say that to anybody. I will fight you. It's fine. The other thing is actually hire and pay young people to be leading your organizations the same amount of money you're paid, and also make sure they get benefits in these jobs and make sure that you're not the person who's burning them out so they leave the movement. I think that is like, you can't do better than that, in my opinion. And I think we need young people to stop being tokenized in leadership positions of adult organizations, similarly to how BIPOC people are. If you're going to hire young people in an organization, allow them to make decisions about what's happening there, and then change the direction of your organization. I think if your young people are just going to live in the future for longer, and I think it's very, very, very vital to the future that we are all in leadership positions equally. And those are two things that I think are true about how you all could help the work.
I don't really have much else to say because Phoebe killed that. But again, like backing off what Phoebe said, don't discount us because we're young. Don't discount us because we're not well known, or we haven't like made a name for ourselves. Like don't discount anyone. Like listen to everyone, hear what they have to say, not just young people, but anyone that you wouldn't necessarily listen to because they don't have some sort of social status or because they don't have the whatever. You got to listen to people.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to remember is join the conversation. Don't try and take it over. And the younger generation has a lot to say. We really want a platform, so I think it's just such a great idea for us to get that platform and for people to listen to us and hear what we have to say, going off what Nat said. So
That's wonderful. One little personal mantra that I try to keep in mind all the time and in my interactions all through my day is to be confident about what I have to offer in any particular interaction with anybody, and then humble about what I have to learn at the same time. And if I can pull that off, then I feel like I am setting myself up for lifelong learning in a way that's really meaningful and not missing out on those opportunities to learn that are often right in front of you. And if you don't take them, it's on you. So I love what you have to say. Okay, and so speaking of, are there questions that you really wanted to get to that we haven't covered before we open it up to the audience? You can take mine too if you want to. I scribbled all over it.
Yeah, the main barriers one. That's one that
Yeah, go for it.
All right. This is one that I really think is important. What are the main barriers that are stopping us as a whole from being able to combat the climate crisis? Okay. thinking very broadly, and then like working my way down, the systems that are set in place in our country are huge barriers. One being capitalism and how it works us, and how capitalism in itself is unsustainable. It is all about producing for the market, taking raw materials, taking labor from people, and making more and more and more, because there's always there's the need for production that is inherently unsustainable, and that is a huge barrier to combating the climate crisis, because it is at the root of the climate crisis, and without dismantling capitalism, we cannot fix the climate crisis. That's one of them. Another thing that is overarching and a big part of our society is white supremacy, and how it is a part of capitalism, and how it silences voices that are being impacted the most. Again, the right to comfort, the urgency that comes with capitalism, and the more and more and more overworking us, leading to burnout. The two of those go hand in hand, and they're huge barriers that are stopping us from fighting the climate crisis, and they're also the reason for the climate crisis.
I think the main barrier is probably the political system. So we have, like, even in New Hampshire, you get paid, I think, $1,000 a year to be a legislator. So, what'd you say? 100. Yikes. Um, so I mean, you can't be a legislator. You can't even try and make change in policy and legislation and write the legislation unless you already have money. You already have enough privilege to not have to worry about holding down a day job. You like that literally prevents anyone who's not rich from the legislature and making change, and that automatically skews things so that, like, no policy that is, say, like, higher taxes aren't going to get through the legislature. Anything that hurts their pockets isn't going to get through the legislature, and it's just like that everywhere. I mean, the system of electoral votes allows places like Wyoming to have outsized power over the entire country in terms of who we elect as president. It just, everything has been designed in a way that is inherently unequal and lets a pretty small contingent of people make the rules for everyone else in the United States and New Hampshire.
I don't have a ton to say to this, but I do have a closing thought whenever it's time for that. Is that a now time? Okay. I would just sort of to add on the tangent, I'm like still thinking the question I answered before. Oh no, it's happening. Okay, it's coming back. A lot of times I hear from adults that I trust, especially when I was in college and high school, of like, oh, it's so cool that you're so idealistic. Like, that's going to end. Like, someday you're going to wake up and get a day job or whatever. Or like, wow, I used to be like you, but now I'm not. That is, first of all, there are plenty of adult role models in my life now who are in their 90s who are still radical. So, like, these people exist. And also, why not? Why shouldn't young radical people be leading? We're not doing it right. Like, we're all here trying to learn about alternative ways of doing things because we know the current direction is not a good one. And I think the more we can lean into the narrative of young people having this energy and drive as an extreme gift to the world, not as a thing that's naive, because it's not. It's seeing the truth of the matter. I really believe that. And I think if more people thought that way, more young people would be in positions of power because we've got ideas and things to try that might just work. You never know.
I so relate to what you just said. And so I'm not a young person, but I have been told, and even just recently, like, Anthea, you have a very cartoonish idea of justice or fairness. And I think, like, how patronizing. And no, like, the world needs people who are willing to hold themselves and other people to a high standard of integrity. And so I I totally reject that when people come at me from that angle. And I try to be, I try to aspire to be more a be the change rather than play the game kind of person. So anyway, I applaud you for holding your lines and sticking to your guns. Any other final thoughts that before we turn it over to the audience? Okay. All right, let's do it. Any questions?
Taking off on one of the things that you just said, I'm curious as to who you've had, all three of you, all four of you, as role models, not causes or anything, but role models in your life, whether it be a teacher, parent, or whatever, and how that influenced your development into what you are today.
I have one, so I'll vamp while they. Oh, you want to go?
Say like many role models, but in the summer of 2020, after I graduated college, I briefly worked at as an intern at 350 Massachusetts in Boston, and their legislative director, who spends all day chasing politicians and making deals and wheeling and dealing, used to be absolutely no degree in politics and is about the best at her job of anybody I've seen and takes zero crap from anybody. And I just completely fell in love with her. She's like 45. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're my favorite. She has a Southern accent. She's from Virginia. And she totally stuck out at the State House. And everyone gave her so much respect and so much time. And she has gotten so much policy done and organized in Massachusetts. It's just remarkable. And I think like having a go-get-it attitude she's definitely someone I look up to for that. Her name is Cabell Ames. If you're ever looking for a cool person to talk to, she still works for 350.
This is a hard question. If you couldn't tell by my face after the question was asked. But for me, I don't have like one person that sticks out. I have just like an amalgamation of people. A lot of them are people that are a part of organizations that I have either been a part of or still in part of. And these are people either my age or only like 5 or 10 years older than me who are really passionate about the work they do and just keep going and also work to dismantle their the things that they've been taught and rebuild and relearn. And it's just, a lot of my role models are the people who are my age who are really fighting against all of this. And like the people who are a part of the organizations. I mean, Phoebe and I have both been a part of New Hampshire Youth Movement, and a lot of the people in that org are huge role models for me. I have a friend here who's honestly a big role model of mine, Joy. And so it's just a big group of people who are who are around my age, who are young, who are, who want to see better. And it's really nice.
I actually completely agree with that. During my time at 350 New Hampshire, I've a lot of times been the youngest person in the room. So I've had a lot of people around me to look up to and watch as they went out and did great things. And my section of the organization is mainly focused on high schoolers. So as a lot of people have graduated, they've gone out into the world and joined college organizations and spent time organizing and protesting and generally fighting for systemic change overall. And I've seen how much their passion has transferred even after they left the organization and how many different things all of them have done. So one of them is, I think, currently working with a sexual assault awareness organization. Two of them are with the New Hampshire Youth Movement. One of them's out organizing in Arizona while she goes to college. all of them are just inspiring, and I really want to be, like them when I am ready to move out into the world and try and do my own thing in terms of organizing.
Well, I can share just a quickie that when I was a girl, the person who inspired me the most, and as a public personality, even though she's known to be rather reclusive, was Jane Goodall. And I heard her on the radio recently when she was on this press junket for her new book. And I was thinking, man, she is just as cool now, if not more, than she ever was. And I think what appealed to me, lots of things. I mean, she was living her life on her own terms in such a radical way. But I was also so impressed. And actually, I went on to study monkeys. I mean, she had that big of an impression on me. I studied monkeys in the wild for many years as a graduate student. There's something so powerful. There's like a gentle power about her. She's strong and gentle. She's kind and decisive. And I think that leadership style is more relevant now than ever before. And so I really love this concept of leaning into that caring, strong, gentle, decisive leadership style. I think that sort of classic command and control, almost bullying style of leadership is dying. I'm happy to see that happening and really leaning into this gentler style of leadership, which is something I'm inspired by her to this day. So, another question from the audience?
I have a question for Phoebe. How did you get rid of Paula Page and get Janet Mills in there? Because Maine was almost as bad as New Hampshire in terms of energy policy, renewables, and you guys are really tearing it up. You're doing great. So tell us, how do we get rid of Sununu?
Well, two caveat. Well, first of all, we're back still trying to get rid of Paula Page, so wish us luck. He termed out, so he never ran against Janet Mills, which was probably a really good thing. But I mean, I think Maine, like most states, from my analysis, and I think analysis of many organizations, is a truly purple state where people vote for people they know, which is why Susan Collins has been in office for longer than I've been alive. And can't leave, is unable to get ousted. Last 4 years, but my hope is my organization's planning on starting like next week a pretty strong push at Janet Mills, who's pretty private, in getting her to say some things about how she's going to show up for young people, because she has absolutely not championed young people in a pretty specific, very clear way. She made some decisions, as in like she didn't close the last youth prison in Maine that only houses 18 people and costs the state $20 million a year. She didn't close it, and she didn't do anything for Indigenous sovereignty. So those are some hard pills to swallow in supporting her, but I think young people have the ability to push her to say things in this next month and a half. So hopefully she gets reelected and we're able to move in and push her further to the left, which is always the goal.
I think the gentleman in the green bandana, you have a question?
Thank you. They, them pronouns, by the way. Yeah, so I'm just thinking about, so we've situated this in like rural, radically rural, and thinking about it in the context of the United States. But when we look around the world and we look at the climate crisis, the places that are most affected are also rural, but we would conceive of them in a different way. I'm thinking about how in Kerala, India, hundreds of thousands of people led by communists won major concessions from their government. And how in a community like Keene or anywhere in the United States, which is rural, we actually the main industries in Keene, we have a large service sector, a lot of the food and the materials that come in to make the businesses that we consider rural come from the deep exploitation of the global South. And that comes out of like imperialist extraction, which is supported by the US military. which is one of the world's biggest polluters. It's actually impossible to quantify how bad the pollution problem from the United States military is by itself. So my question is, as organizers of any age, but specifically for the youth, how do we situate our approach to our rural communities in New Hampshire, in the United States, in relation to the communities in Peru, in India, in Sudan, all around the world, that our comfort of life is coming from the extreme exploitation and suffering? How do we situate our struggle with theirs?
That's a really good question. I think, at least from my own experience, there's a lot of lack of information, lack of education, lack of actually knowing this information, knowing that, like, knowing where our food systems come from. Like, you know, most of our food isn't grown here. And so it's exported, imported, it's being grown, it's being harvested in other places in the world. And we need to, as a whole, understand this. We need to understand our food systems, understand, how things are made. Like, this pencil, who made it? Whose hands, how much were they paid to make this pencil? We really need to look into, like, the things around us and, like, how they came to be, and understand that there's a lot of exploitation that happens and a lot of suffering for our comfort, and realizing that we do live in a place of privilege and a place of comfort. And in order to combat that, we have to learn. And once we learn, we have to work to dismantle the systems that oppress and exploit these people.
Your question's really fantastically worded, and definitely I think less about international solidarity than I probably should. But here's a thing that I've been thinking about. You asked, and whatever you want to call the 99% or whomever, everyone who's not a boss and at the top, have been divided purposefully by the people at the top through history. The creation of whiteness simply to divide British people from Irish people, then to bring Irish people on board to be white so that you could divide them from Italian people, to bring Italian people, right? Like, it's all about creating these divides so that works that people, oppressed people, have less power. And I think a lot of what I do, and when I talk about international solidarity and even solidarity with we've been working a lot with migrant workers in solidarity with their organizations for people, helping people see, like, there are workers here and there are workers there, and you know what it feels like to be you here, and you can only begin to imagine what it feels like to be a worker in Peru right now, but you know that our struggle is linked, that it's not an individual thing. And I think reminding people of the greater movement of collective liberation and helping folks in rural areas understand that as a totally inaccessible concept if you don't explain it and if you're not exposed to it, are some of the things that I do, and I think comes up in our work, is talking about those bigger issues. But yeah, I have no answers on how to show up for international workers at this time.
To me, it kind of seems like the biggest solution is probably education, so that more privileged people in the U.S. Get to see how everyone else is living and their working conditions. And I was in Ecuador this summer, and I spent some time on a quinoa farm, and I saw just how much work it takes to get like one tiny little quinoa seed, maybe, I don't know what they're called, 1 unit of quinoa. But it's so much effort and so much hard work and sweat, and then it gets sold to the United States, and it's sold for so much that the people in actual Ecuador, where it is grown, can't afford quinoa because it's being exported at such a high rate. And it just, like, that gave me a new perspective on international labor. And it just seems like everyone could benefit from more of that kind of education and exposure to international workers and international working conditions.
Just a quick aside, talking about education, working to make education accessible and free, because knowledge is incredibly important. Knowledge is power. And the reason it's not free is because they're trying to take away power from people, especially poor people and people with marginalized identities.
I'm so busy writing down your words that I'm neglecting my duties here. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Hi. So you all kind of agreed that like conflict is a good thing in cases and everything, and that you mentioned that sometimes we avoid conflict for the comfort of our own, and especially another people as well, just trying to do it. How would you? Is there any advice you would give? Not only like if you're in a situation where maybe you're prioritizing your own comfort, but maybe to help other people also get out of that comfort zone and actually get them to have more conflict in their lives as well?
Yeah, so going back to what I mentioned when I said right to comfort, it is a product of white supremacy culture. And so I don't have the answer to like how to dismantle it, but I do think it is important to have conversations with your family, have conversations with those closest to you, especially when those walls start to come up, be like, hey, you know, why is that happening? Why are you feeling defensive? What's going on here? And try to like look deeper into that and do some like self-analysis. I highly recommend like looking up on Google. It's like dismantlingracism.com. They share the, I believe, like 14 characteristics of white supremacy, and like having a discussion with people and also looking through it yourself and being like, where does this show up in my life? Because those really do inhibit important conversations that are difficult, that can be seen as conflict if they're not treated with the right like respect and dignity.
I think like Anthea touched on it recently or like a little bit ago about sort of a like mantra that you say, and I have a similar one around like if it's not uncomfortable then nothing's changing. And I mean, you got to take that with a grain of salt. Like some things are uncomfortable and nothing's changing. And so it's not fair to say like, wow, I keep having the same argument with my racist uncle and dang, nothing's like something's got to be changing. I feel so uncomfortable. But I think genuinely like letting people know when you're talking to them, like, hey, this might make you feel uncomfortable, but I've been thinking about this. Like I say that a lot to people, like it's okay if you feel uncomfortable right now, because like so do I. And I don't know how to make this more comfortable because it's a hard thing. And helping remind people that it's not their fault that they feel uncomfortable. I think what Nat was touching on around white supremacy is like we don't know how to white people don't know how to talk about race. It's like by design. And so anytime race comes up or a person of color calls you out on something or even just brings up the concept of race, a lot of white people completely shut down, and that's not their fault. It's by design. So reminding people in all things, money, it might be education, any taboo topic, helping people like be like, yeah, it's okay if we talk about money in this space. Like that's an okay thing. Like I say those kind of things in front of people and it sounds like I'm weird, but like in reality, I think it helps put people at ease going in, like moving towards an uncomfortable place.
Yeah, that was really well stated. I don't think I have anything else to add.
I think I wrote all of that down as fast as I could. And I think you had a question too.
There's been so many amazing questions from the audience that I'm like, oh, I can't compete. This one's a little, just going back to the keynote from today. Chloe had that point about the difference between the work she was doing in Maine, rural Maine, versus her friends who were campaigning in cities where they could, you know, make a lot more progress and there's this greater density. And with that kind of in mind, I'm curious if you have any recommendations for kind of jump-starting youth climate action in an area where it might not exist, and maybe it's hard to like find your people because it's just like, where are my people? Especially I think for people who are outside of school, like it's easy in school to have those clubs, but Yeah, so the question is recommendations for kind of jump starting that.
When you say finding your people, I think especially in rural communities, your community are your people. And yes, I think in rural communities or just in communities in general, there's going to be a vast variety of different views. But I think that can be, I feel like that could be worked with. And I feel like, it's more about getting people together and finding that common ground that we're all being, exploited, and we're all being, overworked. We're all exhausted, and, finding that commonality, and like working with that, and then having these discussions with your community, with that rural community, and hosting maybe educational spaces that are free and accessible, because I love that. Big fan of those. And just, offering that to everyone in your community, and then trying again to find that common ground that like we all, want better. We all want, to be taken care of. Like we all want to make sure that we can like live lives that, where we can support ourselves, support our loved ones, and just, thrive. And so I think, your community are your people that you're finding.
Yeah, I think it is pretty important to remember that. I mean, there are just so many differences between organizing in an urban or rural setting. Like, you're not going to get that group of automatically like-minded people like you are going to get in an urban setting. So I think when you're rural, like you're in New Hampshire, I think it's just so important to connect on an individual level and find people who you individually vibe with and share beliefs with and can talk to about things like climate organization, before you try starting a group. So like a lot of recruiting that I've done for 350 New Hampshire is making friends with people, and then if I find out they're interested in the climate, that's when I ask them, because like we're in a purple state. Not a lot of people aren't super open to liberal climate action, and it's really great when you can recruit someone for the climate movement based on them trusting you and thinking that, wow, they kind of seem like they know what they're doing. They seem like they care. I want to get in on that.
Two very actionable steps for you. One is go to the library a lot. I spend all my time at the library, like working on my laptop, and people like come in and out of the library and they have conversations, and then you can like butt in and be like, yo, you sound like you're talking about like a cool thing to do. Like, is that some type of climate organizing or like, and the other thing is because I think you're the main person, right? Sweet. I would like, what I did a little bit is like put in some time driving to protests and rallies and then just talk to everybody there, because you're going to find people who live near you, because a lot of people will drive, and it's like a great way to condense everybody and then like disperse back out. You could join Maine Youth Power. Look at me, that's cool. But yeah, I think genuinely, just as Nikhil was saying, like it's so relational. My organization is doing voter turnout this fall, and our model is entirely relational. We're absolutely doing no door knocking and no cold calling. We're just inviting people to text their friends to vote in like an extremely organized fashion. And our goal is to turn out 4,500 young people to vote. And we're like on our way. I think it's like rural communities, it's all about like just anybody you meet and seeing if they might have any interest in climate organizing. But I've done both the library and the protest method successfully. So those are my tips.
Well, I see we're just about at time, and I would really love to give the panelists the last word. So I'm thinking if you want to last nugget, or it could be any final thought that you want to share, we can go down the line, maybe a wish for the future or a final sentiment. But before I hand over the mic, I just want to thank you for being here today and sharing your thoughts and your experiences so generously. I want you to know that you made a big impact on me. It's indelible, and I can't tell you how intellectually enlivened, I feel, by this conversation, and I hope we stay in touch. I'm going to be tracking you down. And also just to say, I mentioned as we were getting ready to come up on stage that I'm the mother of a 13-year-old boy, and it gives me hope knowing that he can follow in your footsteps and he can be led by you and inspired by you. It makes me feel excited about his environmental future. So thank you.
I really just want to thank everyone for coming, and obviously you guys all really care about the climate and you want to see change, and I'm really happy that everyone is here today learning more about the movement and all the different aspects of the movement, and this has been really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to thank you all and all the wonderful questions and just like listening to us for an hour and a half. Like, that's a lot of listening. I can't do that. I have to talk. I'm a talker. And just again acknowledging that without climate justice, like climate justice can't exist without racial justice, without queer justice, without disability justice, without all of these intersectional aspects and identity. And just focus on one is to exclude the others. Or, well, I don't want to say exactly that, but it's important to have a wide lens in when thinking about climate justice.
I'm going to plug my organization. Absolutely. If you have social media or are on the internet, find us. Our name's maineyouthpower.org everywhere on all platforms, or just Maine Youth Power. I'm very available to talk to people. If anyone ever wants to talk to me, I'm happy to give you my email. And I would say, like, continue to attach yourselves to movements and things and momentum that feels good, and not to momentum that feels stressful. So if you're doing organizing and you're like, I'm just stressed out all the time, analyze why and then change something about what you're doing. We need every single person to be organizing, in my firm belief. And so please do that. Thanks so much for being here.